Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the ManageIQ Sprint 80 review. I'm Dan Clarizio. I'm going to be your guest speaker, I guess. Next slide, please. All right, so as usual, we'll go over the tasks here. We got the statistics that I'll cover. I roped Zita in to do the UI, so she's all ready for that. We're going to get a status on the UI and UX for the V2V project, which is moving along pretty well. And we got Bronagh, Adam, and Rich all going to talk about the provider work. Tina's going to cover some of the automate changes. In the platform area, Jillian's going to cover for Greg T. And Alberto will discuss the REST API. Next slide. Great. Okay, so across the repos, looks like we got most of the work was done in the integration test, which is great. So we're getting a bunch of new QE tests. Then you have the UI Classic and the API got a lot of work. Some of that's V2V. Others are some enhancements in UI. Looks like ManageIQ and even Docs got quite a bit of PRs as well. Next slide.
1 second, Dan. I was just checking on something. Okay.
Onward we go. All right, so I was trying to figure out some correlation here. But the only thing I figure is Sprint 79, we had a lot of people on vacation PTO. And even that actually stretched into this sprint as well. So hopefully next sprint it'll pick back up in the cross the 400 line. But that's about all I could figure. So next slide. And here we go. So still smashing a bunch of bugs. We got the final builds out for the G release, and we just squashing things as they come in. And also start working on some enhancements. So we'll see some of that in other people's reports later on. Next slide. There we go. So this isn't too bad. I mean, a little bit of reds going down, but there's some good greens in here, especially in the UI Classic, near and dear to me. So ManageIQ some positives as well. So this is something you want to see trend positively. So like it is a little bit at least this time. And we'll turn this over to Zita for the UI.
So, hi, I'm Zita. And for the user interface, we had 65 PRs in 3 repositories. 39 were labeled bug, 9 were enhancements, 6 refactoring, and 2 technical deaths. Well, some important bug fixes are hiding pagination on no records, several formatting and styling fixes, and enabling buttons on custom button group form after validating required files. Now for enhancement, there's addition of next to disabled automate domain in override area. In expression editor, checkmark and cross buttons were replaced by commit and discard buttons. And for the next 2 enhancements, we will see more on next slide. So next slide, please. So chargeback reports can be grouped by tenants now. Before that, it was only by date, tag, and VMs. Next slide, please. And container projects are allowed to have control policies now. So that's all from me.
Okay, do we have Patrick?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Can you hear me okay? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry. I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm stepping in for Serena now. She's attending some other business meetings today. But just wanted to give like a quick status on what we've been doing with V2V, and we've got several slides, so just going to jump through them really quickly. But this first slide just gives the overall status. We have the happy paths for successful API responses, flows for the mapping wizard, plan wizard, and overview almost completed. So we're kind of going back now and looking at the error messaging for when there's API errors from the backend. But that is pretty much the high level status of where we are right now. Next slide. cool, it's working. So I've got some GIFs, and basically just going to quickly jump through these. So the first step, we are opening the mapping infrastructure mapping wizard and giving it a name and a description. Next slide. On step 2 of the mapping wizard, we can now map clusters, and of course it's many to one. And don't know that I demonstrated that in this GIF. Oh yes, I did. So cluster 1, cluster 2, from VMware over to Rev, and then we have the ability to add those mappings in, remove them individually or completely now. Next slide. And then the same thing, so once we have done a cluster mapping, then we can individually map the data stores and networks for our cluster. So that's one of the things we've been working through this sprint, was actually mocking that data for what the data stores will look like, and then wiring up the UIs for being able to do the mappings. And yeah, you'll see the same thing on the next slide. So let's go ahead and jump to the networks. So again, we're able to map the VMware networks, source networks over to target networks. And again, it's a many to one mapping. So we had a lot of clarity on that this sprint and worked through UX and the iterations on that.
One second. Let me just see if there's someone seems to be not muted. Hold on one second. Sorry. If you're not muted, if you could mute yourself, please. All right, got him. There we go.
Thank you.
I found him. Okay, there we go.
So, and then that completed the data stores and networks mappings. And then step 5, just wanted to show that we were able to construct all of the mappings in our transformation mappings objects and then post those to our sample server. So that's, I just wanted to highlight like what that looks like after we've done all the mapping logic to construct that post. So yeah, next slide. So after we've done the mapping and created the mapping, we can continue from the mapping wizard over to the migration plan wizard. There's a pass-through step that lets you continue over. And then you're selecting the mapping that was constructed on the plan wizard and then giving it a name and a description. Next slide. And then on this step, we're iterating through the backend right now, but this allows you to drag and drop a CSV onto the VM step, upload those VMs. We are working through that, I believe, on this. There's been some API discussion yesterday, but the idea is we're able to create the CSV here, or import a CSV with various fields for the VMs. And then next slide. I think that's it. We have not done the results for the plan wizard. We're still working through that. This slide just shows our placeholder in place now. So once you, long term, we're planning to add those infrastructure mappings onto their own view. Today, we weren't able to implement that, so this is just a placeholder for the POC, but we did go ahead and add the navigation. Next slide.
Yeah, sorry, Patrick. Let me just check one more time. Sounds like someone else might have been unmuted.
Okay.
Sorry for the interruption.
No problem.
No, we're good. Let me get back there. Okay, there we go.
All right, and this is the last slide. So we had a PR going in for this today, which is actually going to visualize the migrations in progress. And I believe we have the status information APIs worked out for the VMs now, and we're still waiting on the database status APIs, it sounds like. So yeah, this has been a really productive sprint, and we're hoping to round this out soon. So I think that is it for V2V.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. You made it through with the interruptions. Thanks.
No problem.
All right, so for providers, myself and Dan Berger will share an update on public cloud providers. Adam will share an update on infrastructure providers, and Rich Oliveri will speak about SmartState Analysis. Next slide, please. So most merge pull requests this sprint came jointly from the Amazon and the VMware repos, followed by OpenStack, and a handful or less from most of the remaining provider repos. Next slide, please. Over to Dan Berger.
There were a couple changes on the Azure side we wanted to bring up. First one falls into that small but important category that I like to bring up, which is a dynamic model generation bug that occasionally had been cropping up, where we were hunting and pecking for specific special characters, and finally we just said, okay, if it's not alphanumeric, it's special. So that solved that problem, so that the refresh parser wouldn't break. The second issue was a while back we had implemented the option to not select a public IP when you provisioned a single VM, and it would default to private. Excuse me. The problem was that broke multi-VM provisioning, where you didn't even have a choice to set public or private, and it would default to private. If they wanted to make to add public IPs, they would have to do it manually or use an automate solution. So here I'm just showing, in the provisioning screen, if you select two or more, let's go to the next slide. You still now see that public IP address option. Before that wasn't there. So now users, if they're provisioning two or more VMs, can say, okay, none means private, or new means dynamically generate a public IP for each VM. And that is it for me. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Dan. So for Amazon, so Alex fixed a bug. It was initially reported for Amazon, but it turns out it actually applies to any provider with graph refresh support. So when a provider was deleted, and then that same provider was added again, a second copy of each virtual machine would remain in an archive state. So that's been fixed. And then Jillian added support for the South America region for the Google provider. Next slide, please. Over to Adam.
Thanks. So on the OpenStack side, the OpenStack team improved the speed of Network Manager refresh by doing a couple nice optimizations there. And we also fixed VM targeted refresh when, after doing a targeted refresh, the VM would be cleared of its cloud tenant, which was causing issues doing reconfigure. On the VMware side, we had now support for adding and removing network adapters. Similarly, we had support for adding and removing disks before, and now someone from the same team added that for network adapters. And the team at XLab has been busy adding support for more options for the vCloud provider, and in this sprint they got in support for VM delete for vCloud, and they're hard at work on a number of other ones. And next slide. For overt, Graph Refresh was only written to support the V4 API, and so there was an issue where if you manually enabled Graph Refresh for overt, but you were pointing to an older management system, it would fail. So now they're only allowing Graph Refresh for V4 supported APIs. And on the container side, there are changes to container SSA to cleanly error out of the job if the metadata can't be fetched instead of failing in a weird way later on. It's now more explicit. And Benny went through and added a number of different options to the Graph Refresh spec testing. So there's more test coverage for Graph Refresh on containers now. Next slide.
Okay. This sprint, we resolved a few issues related to SmartState Analysis. The first one is common for all providers. We had an issue where if there was a bad directory header encountered in our XFS data, it would kind of pick us out of the whole SmartState Analysis. Now we could actually skip that bad data, and most times we can successfully complete the analysis. For SCVMN, the VHDX disk, when we had a parent-child relationship in those disk chains, we always assumed that the disks were of the same type, and that's not a valid assumption. So when we encountered this variant types within the same chain. We didn't handle that properly, and we now have resolved that. For Amazon, most of the issues were surrounding agent deployment. When we deploy a new agent in the Amazon environment, we use SSH, and we were not basically raising exceptions and missing when some of the SSH commands would fail. We now capture that and raise exceptions so they can be logged and tracked later. Also, if the agent is available but not visible to the given provider, given the credentials, we now detect that and raise an exception there as well. And then a related issue, when an agent fails to deploy, we may have multiple SmartState requests queued. We now detect the failure of the agent deployment, and we can clean up the queue, knowing that they would never be serviced because there was a catastrophic failure in the agent deployment. And that's it for SmartState. Next slide, please.
Good morning. We had 11 PRs merged this sprint. We added the V2V transformation models for service template requests and tasks, and added the automate service models for requests and tasks. Next slide, please. Fabian added the initial transformation state machine code to check, enable, and disable the transformation host role. New system request instances were added to support this change. As you can see in the screenshot, Ansible playbook methods are used for role check, enable, and disable. Fabian has a WIP PR that contains the necessary code to transform virtual machines and update the transformation progress. Next slide, please. Madhu added support for importing Git repositories without a master branch. The modified code looks at branch information instead of specifically looking for master. Madhu added state var substitution support as well. Substitution can be used in many ways and is often used in relationships to alter the resolution path based on substituted values. State vars were introduced as a way to persist automate state data between retries. The following examples were taken from Fabian's WIP PR and show how useful state var substitution can be when used in relationships. Next slide, and over to Jillian.
Hey everyone, it's Jillian filling in for Greg. This sprint we had 37 PRs merged, 12 enhancements, 15 bugs, and 10 tech debt tests and other things. A quick overview. So this one was already talked about by Zita, but Libor added group chargeback report for VMs by tenant. Joe V fixed some errors and help messages for MIQ LDAP to SSD. This included a couple of issues, including descriptions and help messages, as well as some spelling errors. And he updated his blog post that was talked about last week to be in sync with those changes. Also fixed were handling group names with encoded special characters. So previously, when you were specifying the remote user groups header with special characters, we had an error, so that's now fixed. Continuing on improving the performance of binary blob parts, the MD5 and size attributes were dropped. This also resolves a couple of bugs that was done by Brandon. Another fix by Yuri is fixing replication validation for not saved subscriptions. While setting up replication, know that a global region validation was throwing an error if PG logical schema was not created first. That's now fixed. And lastly, we singularized a plural model. Asset detail should be asset detail, and Brandon fixed that in all of the places that it needed to be updated. And now off to Alberto.
Okay, thanks, Jillian. So on the API side, we had a busy sprint. First here, we'll list the bug fixes that went in. So Brandon did update the one issue where the asset detail was updated in the model. He did to change that in the API. The rest of them all by Jillian. Let's see, we had the metric rollups error message issue. Default section for metadata for custom attributes when not specified. We need to make sure it's metadata. Cloud tenants and flavors were not consistent in the sub-collection access for as compared to the others. And same thing with those, the collections, we need to make sure they return arrays. For card creation, we needed to make sure that one and only one is allowed to be created Next, for queuing VM and instant actions, we needed to make sure that we specify the user group and tenant for those requests. And lastly, we had an issue where we were carrying a 500 when querying additional attributes in the pictures. And also when editing users, we not supposed to support current group during that edit, so we used to ignore to reject the current group ID, but not the current group reference. So that was fixed in the last one. Next slide, please. Okay, so for enhancements from Igor, we have a new action, apply config pattern on physical servers. So here they needed the ability to specify a customization script on physical servers. So you see that action coming in. First example on a specific resource, and then the example for bulk action. Next slide, please. Okay, so this enhancement by Jillian is actually it's quite good. We have the ability now that the implementation of providers, both the EXT management system and provider model, can let us know what are the additional attributes that are allowed. So we kept the provider implementation that's exposing that out to the API. And in this example, we're creating an Azure Cloud Manager, but if you see in italic the Azure tenant ID, that additional attribute is actually dictated for us from the model implementation. Next slide, please. Okay, so Jillian added the ability to delete search filters. So first example on the individual resource, the action delete, the next example for bulk action, as well as the HTTP delete verb. And in the example below, we're doing a bulk action delete, showing the examples here that you can reference a search filter by ID, href, as well as description. Next slide, please. Okay, so this enhancement by Jillian, so we needed, the service UI needed to know a user's group information, specifically the SUI product features. So, and the way that we implemented this is in the API entry point. The reason for that is a user may not have the entitlement enough to be able to query that separately on the groups. So what we do here is in the identity hash, we provide the SUI product features. So the service UI can decide whether or not the user can switch the group to, what are the other groups that are authorized to that user. So if they don't have the SUI in there, they won't be able to use it. So that kind of drives the SUI logic, which is good. Next slide, please. All right, so yeah, the next three slides are enhancements made by Jillian for V2V support. So this first one here is exposing the primary collection for transformation mappings. So we can create and query them. In this first example, we have sample mapping here, but you can see the transformation mapping items, as was demoed earlier. You can specify source and destination for each of them for clusters, data stores, as well as lands. That's also available. And the queries, regular collection get, individual resource gets, and for the individual resource, you can also expand the transformation mapping items in all the gory details. Next slide, please. Also for V2V, one enhancement we needed to do was to be able to order a service template directly on that collection, not just as a sub-collection of services, or service catalog, sorry. So here, be able to take the order action on the service templates. That's driven by the model implementation, whether the order action is orderable, and that would allow us to order a service template transformation plan directly. And of course, that can be also done by doing the bulk ordering. Next slide, please. Okay, and to complete the offering, we also needed to expose the lands as a primary collection. So getting the collection, the resource, and here as an example, when you query clusters and you want to see the lands relationships, that would be, we'll have the proper hrefs exposed for that since it's now a proper collection. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, we also needed to do 2 enhancements to the API client. The first one, when we query collection actions for a resource, the query was actually very inefficient, and in large environments, this was causing the API client to time out. So 60, 70 seconds has been now just a couple of seconds for doing a request from the master to a lower region. And the next enhancement was to expose the Faraday options for open timeout and timeout to whoever needs to extend that. Those 2 came in for the API clients. That's it for the API. Next slide.
All right. Thanks, Alberto. Thanks, everybody else. Any questions or comments? All right. Don't hear any. Okay, so the next sprint review will be in 2 weeks from today, Sprint 81. Thanks, everybody.